This talk will focus on examining predictors of depression in children. Let me start by telling you why I think we should care about depression among this age group. First, depression in children is exceedingly common. One epidemiological study found that nearly 1 in 4 youth will experience a depressive episode before the age of 20. Further, depression is associated with a variety of negative sequelae, including academic difficulties, substance use, and risky sexual behaviors. Finally, as many as 45% of adolescents who are currently depressed will experience another major depressive episode between the ages of 19 and 24, suggesting the importance of understanding who becomes depressed during adolescence and why they are becoming depressed, so we can focus our intervention and prevention efforts more effectively. The developmental trajectory of depression is one of the best established and most poorly understood phenomena in developmental psychopathology. During childhood, rates of major depression are very low, around 0 to 4%, and boys and girls have equal rates, or boys are slightly more likely to be depressed. Between 13 and 15, rates for both boys and girls begin to rise precipitously. However, rates for girls become twice as large as rates for boys, and these sex differences stay consistent through adulthood. So there are really two things going on here. First, rates for boys rise during adolescence, and second, girls become twice as likely to be depressed as boys, and neither of these phenomena are very well understood. In order to understand what brings about these increases in depression, we need to better understand the risk factors associated with these onset. And while there have been a plethora of candidate risk variables put forward, there's been relatively little work on the developmental trajectories of these likely risk factors themselves. I would argue that it's essential to understand the developmental trajectories of these variables so that we can understand both why depression increases during adolescence and why it increases differentially for boys and girls. Currently, most models of the onset of depression are conceptualized as diathesis stress models, meaning that depression is the product of the interaction between pre-existing vulnerabilities and environmental stressors. For the past 50 years or so, depression researchers have focused on cognitive vulnerabilities in particular. For example, Beck's model of depression suggests that certain people have maladaptive self-schemas that reflect themes of helplessness and unlovability, that are then activated by schema-congruent negative life events. Lynn Abramson and colleagues reformulated learned helplessness theory of depression, or its later incarnation as the hopelessness theory of depression, suggests that there are specific types of biases or attributions that certain people are more likely to make in the face of negative life events. Most recently, response styles theory, posited by Susan Nolan-Hoeksma, suggests that certain people are more likely to ruminate or passively dwell on the causes, consequences, and symptoms of negative affect. She posits that for people who are predisposed to ruminate, the advent of stressful life events brings about depressive symptoms. One thing that makes response styles theory a little different from these other vulnerability stress models, however, is that it was originally posited to explain the gender difference in rates of depression. Specifically, Nolan-Hoeksma and colleagues have found both that women ruminate more than men do, and after controlling for rumination, the gender difference in depression was eliminated. However, the majority of research on rumination has been done in adult populations, and studies of the development of rumination and its relation to depression in children have been more mixed. So we were really interested in finding out if rumination may help explain the rise and prevalence of depressive symptoms and the emergence of gender difference in rates of these symptoms across adolescence. So we wondered, if rumination is responsible for both the increases in rates of depression across adolescence and the emergent gender differences in these rates, what kind of developmental trajectory would rumination need to have to bring about these changes in depressive symptoms? As we said before, diathesis stress models are essentially interactions between pre-existing vulnerabilities and environmental stressors. At their core, these models suggest that there is a relatively stable pre-existing vulnerability that interacts with the onset of stressful life events to produce increases in rates of depression. This alone explains the increases in rates of depressive symptoms we see across ages. However, the emergent gender differences are a little bit more difficult to explain. Essentially, there are two ways in which a diathesis stress model could explain the emergent gender differences that we see. First, if girls carry more of the cognitive vulnerability than boys, even before adolescence, in other words, if girls are more likely to ruminate than boys during childhood, and there is an uptick in the number of stressors that both boys and girls face during adolescence, then you would expect to see the same pattern of rates of depressive symptoms that we actually do see in the real world. The second way that a diathesis stress model could bring about these changes that we see in rates of depression is if the rates of the cognitive vulnerability are the same for both boys and girls prior to adolescence, or in other words, boys and girls could ruminate at the same rate during childhood, but girls are exposed to more stressful events during adolescence than boys are. This interaction could similarly bring about the same developmental trajectory we see in rates of depression. So what we don't know is, first, do the developmental trajectories of rumination and stressful events match those suggested by the diathesis stress model? In other words, are cognitive vulnerabilities rather stable while stressful life events increase during this developmental period? If so, we could adequately explain the age differences in rates of depression that we see. Second, we want to examine the causes of the emergent gender difference in rates of depression. So, are girls more likely to ruminate even during childhood, and do girls experience more stressful events than boys? We had 4 main hypotheses in the current study. First, we hypothesized that there would be a main effect of rumination on depression, or in other words, rumination would be correlated with depression in our sample. This was the first step in establishing a relation between this vulnerability and its negative outcome. Our next set of hypotheses have to do with demonstrating the increase in rates of depression we see across this age group. To establish the age effects we see in depression, we hypothesize that stressful life events will increase with age. Third, we hypothesize that the number of stressful life events youth experience will moderate the relation between rumination and depression. If this hypothesis proved true, we would have established evidence for the classic diathesis stress model. Fourth, we sought to test the 2 different ways in which a diathesis stress model could engender the sex differences in rates of depression that we see, which, if you recall, are either that girls are more likely than boys to ruminate prior to adolescence, which then interact with increasing stressful life events, or that girls have similar rates of depression but different rates of stressful life events. Based on previous research, we hypothesized that girls would have higher rates of rumination, which would interact with stressors that come online during adolescence. For the current study, we went into elementary, middle, and high schools from the Middle Tennessee region. We sent consent forms home to all 5th through 9th graders and ended up with a sample of 363 children. Our sample was largely white and representative of the demographics of the region. We administered a packet of self-report questionnaires, including measures of rumination, depression, and stressful life events. First, I want to show you graphically what mean levels of rumination looked like at each grade level with 95% confidence interval bars. Here, boys are in blue and girls are in green. As you can see, there's a large bump for girls at 5th grade, but then rates seem to slowly rise through the middle school and early high school years. For boys, rates steadily decreased over grade levels. Next, we examined rates of stressful events over time. As you can see, rates of stressful events increase across grades, and girls, on average, report more stressful events than boys. Finally, here's the same graph for depression. We found rates steadily increase over grade level for girls, and that they are kind of all over the place for boys. Follow-up analyses suggest there is a significant main effect for sex on rates of depression, but no effect for age. Further, the age-by-sex interaction was not significant. Our general plan was to first establish a link between rumination and depression in our sample. Next, we wanted to examine the rates of stressful events across our sample. Third, we wanted to test our diathesis stress model, so we looked at a rumination by life events interaction predicting depression. Finally, we examined gender differences in rates of both rumination variables and our stressful life events variable to explain emerging gender differences in depressive symptoms. We were also interested in looking at these variables from a developmental perspective. So we tested a 4-group model of the relation between our latent rumination and depression factors in younger and older boys and girls. First, we established factorial invariance for the model, suggesting that our manifest measures are loading onto the latent factors in the same way across groups. Second, we examined whether the correlation between the factors was different across our groups, and found it indeed was not. So using the whole sample, we found a correlation between rumination and depression of 0.78, which is very sizable. Next, we looked at differences in the means and variances of our latent constructs between our groups. Looking first at the variances, we found both our younger and older girls had significantly greater variance in both rumination and depression than either of our boy groups, suggesting that there are more individual differences in rates of depression and rumination for these constructs. Looking at differences in the latent construct means, we found among boys, younger boys ruminated more than older boys, and among older children, girls ruminated more than boys. Among our younger group, girls were more depressed than boys. Next, we wanted to examine rates of stressful life events across our sample. To examine this, we looked at a simple correlation between age and stressful life events. We found a small but significant increase in rates of stressful life events across our sample. Now that we had established both that there is a relation between rumination and depression and that rates of stressful life events do increase with age, it was time to test our diathesis stress model. We created a structural equation model in which we regressed depression on rumination, negative life events, and their interaction, controlling for age. We found that each of these paths was significant. In order to understand better what this interaction looked like, we created a graph of rumination by stressful life events. Because models of interactions between manifest and latent variables are relatively new, there's no standard approach that I'm aware of for modeling these interactions. So the graph shown here was derived by graphing a manifest composite rumination factor and the life events measure to give you a general depiction of what this interaction looks like. So here you can see that for people who experience relatively fewer stressful life events, rumination is not significantly predictive of depression. However, children who both endorse engaging in rumination and experience greater numbers of stressful events are at the highest risk for experiencing depressive symptoms. Finally, we sought to examine potential causes of the emergent gender difference in rates of depression by examining whether girls either carry a greater vulnerability to depression or are exposed to greater numbers of stressors that activate these vulnerabilities. First, we examined whether girls have consistently higher levels of rumination across late childhood and early adolescence. We looked at a simple correlation between sex and our latent rumination factor and found, indeed, that sex was related to rumination. Next, we sought to show that girls carry higher levels of this vulnerability even prior to adolescence. We looked at a model including an age by sex term. If the gender differences in rumination are relatively constant across ages, then we would not expect to see a significant age by sex interaction, and indeed we found no significant sex or sex by age paths predicting our latent rumination factor. Second, we sought to examine whether negative life events increase more for boys that are Second, we sought to examine whether negative life events increase more for girls than for boys. If negative life events increase differentially for boys and girls, we would suspect that an age by sex interaction would significantly predict number of negative life events. However, the sex by age interaction was not a significant predictor of negative life events. Removing the interaction term from the model, we did find that significant effect for both age and sex, indicating that negative life events increase with age and are more prevalent among girls. So in sum, we examined two overarching models of the development of depression across adolescence and the accompanying emergence of gender differences in rates of depression. This study yielded several important findings. First, we found an overall gender difference in rates of depression, but failed to find an age difference in rates of depression in our sample. I suspect this is because we designed our sample to capture changes in vulnerabilities to depression, and our sample may have been too young to capture the time frame in which you see upticks in the rates of depression per se. Second, we found significant age and gender differences in rumination, indicating that girls ruminate more than boys. However, we found that rumination levels were negatively associated with age, suggesting that the younger kids in our sample were ruminating more than older kids. There are two probable explanations for this finding. The first is that the relation was heavily influenced by our fifth graders, and this may be something of a statistical fluke. However, several seminal papers by John Abella and colleagues examining a sample of third and seventh graders also found that younger children in this study ruminated more than their older children. Interestingly, we both use self-report measures of rumination, and I wonder, given that this measure requires a certain amount of metacognition to determine how you react to a certain mood state, if the younger children are interpreting the measure differently than older children. Regardless, this phenomenon is worthy of future studies. Third, we found support for a diathesis stress model, which suggests that boys and girls endorse a tendency to ruminate prior to adolescence, with girls reporting more ruminative tendencies than boys, and that these ruminative tendencies interact with stressful events to bring about increases in level of depression. Finally, we found that girls are both more likely to endorse ruminating at greater levels than boys across age groups, and that they are more likely to experience more stressful life events. However, stressful life events did not increase differentially for boys and girls. Ultimately, our results supported this model, which suggests that girls are predisposed to ruminate even more prior to adolescence, but that this vulnerability does not become toxic until it interacts with stressful life events that come online during adolescence. I would like to thank all of my collaborators for their help and input on this project, and specifically Dr. David Cole and his lab at Vanderbilt University. If you have any questions about this or any other aspects of my research, please feel free to be in contact.